All right, so you really want to understand how the world works, like the real deal. Today we're going deep on a book that's been shaping leaders for centuries. Machiavelli's The Prince.
Yeah, The Prince. Not exactly light reading, but
Well,
definitely fascinating.
oh, absolutely. It's incredible how relevant it still is today.
It really is. It's remarkable how a text written in the 1500s can still resonate in the 21st century. It's like a blueprint for
Yes,
decoding global power plays.
it is. And we've got excerpts from a scholarly article, Machiavelli's The Prince and its application to contemporary geopolitical issues, to help us break this down. And it connects these ideas from Machiavelli to the conflicts we're seeing play out on the world stage right now.
Yeah, perfect.
So our deep dive today is all about testing the relevance of the prince in the modern world. Do countries actually operate based on these principles? Is power really the ultimate goal, even if it means making tough choices?
That's the big question, isn't it? And Machiavelli gives us some pretty thought-provoking answers. We have to remember that he was writing during a time of just immense upheaval in Italy. His perspective was shaped by constant warfare, political maneuvering, so his advice was all about survival and control, even if it meant, bending the rules a little bit.
Right. Okay, so let's get into the specifics here. What were Machiavelli's core principles, and how do they apply to what we're seeing today?
Well, there are three concepts that really stand out. First, power is everything. Forget about being a good ruler in the traditional sense. For Machiavelli, success is all about acquiring and holding on to power, even if you have to use some, shall we say, unconventional tactics.
So it's less about morality and more about strategy, being adaptable.
Exactly. A true Machiavellian leader is one who knows how to seize any opportunity, adapt to new situations. It's about being pragmatic, putting the state's interests above all else.
Okay, now this next one is always a little bit jarring, right?
Hmm.
Machiavelli argued that it's better to be feared than loved as a leader.
Definitely raises some eyebrows. Yeah.
It's important to understand the context, though. He's not advocating cruelty just for the sake of being cruel. What he's saying is that you need to cultivate respect, prevent uprisings, make sure there's stability. Think about how countries use things like military displays, economic sanctions. Those actions, they're designed to project strength, discourage challenges.
I see. So it's all about sending a very clear message. Don't mess with us.
Exactly. And this leads right into his third point, the importance of military strength. Machiavelli really believed that military might was essential for defense, quelling dissent and projecting power on the world stage.
And when we look at the world today, it seems like everyone's trying to beef up their military. Major powers like the US and Russia, but smaller countries too.
Oh yeah, for sure. Maintaining a strong military is often seen as the best way to prevent other countries from attacking you and to hold on to your power, especially in a world that's so volatile right now. It's a competitive world out there. Let's look at a current example where these principles seem to be playing out. The war in Ukraine. It feels like a textbook case, tragically.
It really is. Tragic. But if you look at it through the lens of Machiavelli, Russia's actions make a lot of sense. They see it as protecting their interests, preventing NATO expansion, taking control of Ukraine, creating a buffer zone, trying to keep Western influence out.
So from their perspective, this invasion, it's all about strategy, protecting what they see as vital, even if it means using force.
Yes. And their military strength, it's a tool to achieve those objectives. And to prevent anyone from getting involved, their message is, we're serious about defending what we see as our territory.
But on the flip side, we see the West responding with its own set of, Machiavellian tactics, the support for Ukraine, the sanctions on Russia. It's all about pushing back.
Absolutely. It's fascinating, actually. This is a perfect example of how multiple players can apply Machiavelli's principles, even if they have totally different goals. The West is using its own power. Economic leverage, military aid, diplomacy, all of it, to try and weaken Russia, stop further aggression, and make sure the global balance of power doesn't shift too dramatically.
So in a way, they're all playing from the same playbook.
It's more nuanced than that, of course. But the parallels are there, and it raises a question, is this constant power struggle, this idea that one side wins and the other loses, is that really the way to peace and stability?
That's a big question, and one we'll keep exploring as we go through more examples. Speaking of strategic partnerships, let's shift gears to the Middle East, the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, another example where things get very Machiavellian.
Oh, absolutely. You've got this rivalry between two really powerful nations, both wanting to control the region, and they're constantly maneuvering, forming alliances, projecting strength. It's like classic Machiavellian strategy in action.
Yeah, it's interesting how they're not just relying on their own strength, but also building these partnerships, these alliances, to try to tip the balance in their favor. Saudi Arabia has that strong relationship with the U.S., while Iran's been cultivating its own network of allies and these proxies.
Yeah, that's a key point. Machiavelli knew that power wasn't just about military force. It's about using relationships and influence cleverly. And in the Middle East, we see that playing out in all sorts of ways: military aid, arms deals, diplomacy, even covert ops. Every move is calculated to strengthen their own position and weaken their rival.
When we talk about proxies, what exactly does that mean? It sounds kind of shady.
A proxy war is basically a conflict where the big powers are backing opposite sides, but they don't fight each other directly. Like Iran has been accused of supporting certain armed groups, right, in places like Yemen, Lebanon. It lets them exert influence and get what they want without having to commit to a full-blown war.
So it's a way to extend their reach, their influence, without putting their own troops at risk. It's almost like playing chess.
Yeah.
Moving pieces around the board to try to get a better position.
Exactly. And then you have the U.S., with its long history in the Middle East, a key ally to Saudi Arabia for decades, providing security, military support, that kind of thing.
But hasn't the U.S. also tried to engage with Iran diplomatically, like
Yeah.
with the nuclear deal a while back? How does that fit into this whole Machiavellian framework?
Well, don't forget that diplomacy can be a tool of power, too. The U.S. is trying to manage this incredibly complex situation, contain Iran's influence while keeping its strategic partnership with Saudi Arabia. It's a delicate balancing act, for sure.
It sounds like they're constantly juggling different priorities, adjusting their strategy. Like there are no easy answers in this part of the world.
No, not at all. The Middle East really shows how Machiavelli's ideas about power, strategy, alliances, they're all still relevant in the 21st century. They're shaping international relations today.
Okay, so for our last case study, let's move over to the South China Sea. Things are tense over there, China showing its strengths, the U.S. is pushing back. It feels like another one of these flashpoints where we see those Machiavellian principles at work.
It definitely is. The South China Sea is incredibly strategic. Whoever controls those waters controls vital shipping lanes, access to resources, the ability to project military power. Everything China is doing, the island building, the military presence, it's all part of a bigger plan to dominate and secure their interests.
So it's about sending a message to their neighbors, to the U.S., a classic example of what we were talking about earlier, projecting power, using that fear as a tactic.
Exactly. China's showing they're not afraid to challenge the status quo, assert their claims, even if it could lead to conflict. They're building up their military to strengthen their position and discourage anyone from challenging them.
But the U.S. isn't just watching this happen, right? They're sending their own warships through the region, bolstering alliances with countries like the Philippines, Japan. It has all the hallmarks of a classic power struggle.
It's like something straight out of Machiavelli's playbook, this whole idea of power balancing. The U.S. is using its military, its diplomacy, its network of allies, all to try to counter China's moves and prevent them from getting too powerful.
And the stakes just keep getting higher. Are we stuck with this kind of competition where one side's win is automatically the other side's loss? Is this what happens when countries just look out for their own interests?
That's a question that people have been debating for centuries. Machiavelli's ideas are powerful. They help us understand how power works, but they don't necessarily predict the future. There are other things at play too: international law, ethics, the desire for cooperation, people's desire for peace.
But it's not just black and white, my makes, right? There's still room for diplomacy working together even when there's a lot of tension.
Yeah, it's reassuring to think that even in this world, this power struggle, there's still room for finding solutions, working together. Definitely. And it's important to remember that Machiavelli wasn't necessarily saying that leaders should be totally ruthless. I mean, he was writing during a very specific time, a dangerous world. He was offering a way to survive.
So it's not so much a guidebook for how to be a tyrant and more like a framework for understanding how power works.
Yeah, I think that's a much better way to look at it. His ideas can help us figure out why countries do what they do, even if we don't agree with it. It's like understanding the game without having to endorse every play.
That makes sense. So for those of us who aren't exactly world leaders dealing with all this, what's the takeaway here? What can we learn from Machiavelli and the Prince?
I think the most important thing he gives us is that emphasis on critical thinking. He forces us to question everything we think about power, about morality, about leadership. He wants us to look deeper and see those forces that shape our world, even the ones that aren't so pleasant.
So it's about being informed, engaged citizens, right?
Mhm.
Understanding how power works so we can hold our leaders accountable and work towards a world where there's more cooperation, more peace.
Exactly. And it brings up something interesting that wasn't really covered in our source material. We've been focusing on countries as the main players, but what about all these other groups that are getting more and more powerful? Like big corporations, international organizations, even social movements. Where do they fit into this whole Machiavellian world?
That's a great point. Are they playing by the same rules? Are they also driven by power and self-interest? Or is it something different?
It's complicated for sure. And I think it's something we need to look at more closely. Machiavelli probably didn't see these new players coming, but his ideas about strategy and influence, they still seem relevant today, even in this new context.
Definitely something to think about.
Hmm.
It just goes to show that even an old text like The Prince can still make us ask new questions, challenge our assumptions.
It really does. It's amazing how these ideas have so much staying power. They continue to shape how we see the world, even after all these centuries.
Absolutely. Well, I think that wraps up our deep dive into Machiavelli's world. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep asking those tough questions and stay curious.